And today we have Sister Ingrid Peterson, who is going to speak on Clare of Assisi. Sister has a PhD in English literature from the University of Iowa with an emphasis on medieval literature. Oh, the Iowans are all cheering. She has written several books and articles about Clare. She has taught at St. Teresa's College in Winona, and I have to mention that she was on the Board of Governors and met a lady named Dorothy Callahan, whom we're both very fond of, who was on that board. Quincy University, the Tao Center in Winona, and St. Bonaventure University in New York. She's written many articles and books about Clare of Assisi. Won't you help me welcome Sister Ingrid?
Thank you very much, Jane. I'm very, very happy to be here. As you can tell just by looking at me, I'm coming to the end of my career, and it's still very much with me. And I was just saying to Jane this morning, just an hour is just the ideal time for me, and a group like you too. A little bit about my personal background. I'm not at all unfamiliar with the Lutherans, having a dad who's a Lutheran, and an Irish mother. However, they have a Swedish dad and an Irish mother. And I was born in northern Wisconsin, and then went to St. Teresa's and met the sisters there, and became a sister of St. Francis back in the late 50s. So everything about me now, when I talk about myself, it's always late. It was a long time ago. So anyway, while I was in graduate school at the University of Iowa, I was majoring in medieval and Renaissance literature, and I ran into a wonderful woman teacher who was very interested in the mystics. And I thought, well, what are the mystics, and who cares about the mystics? And I'm going to get a credit for doing this, besides all that. And I got hooked on them, and I've never gotten away since. So, and then, obviously, because Francis of Assisi and Clare of Assisi lived in the Middle Ages, the period that I studied was just the background for them. So I was able to, well, I wrote what I called a biographical study on Clare of Assisi, because we were, as women, we're always looking for our own tradition. And Clare of Assisi, there was not, Francis, everybody knew Francis of Assisi, but not about, very much about Clare. Much hadn't been discovered yet. But the women's movement and the women's scholars were searching out documents and translations of women's writings. So I've been going regularly to the Medieval Congress, which is in Kalamazoo, Michigan, which is where I began to meet and get interested in these other scholars who are working on women's mystics particularly. And I can remember just thinking about that, going to a session one time where some of the women were just beginning to read the translations of the women's voices, talking about their experience of God, and I was just moved to tears to hear women from that time explaining and talking about their relationship with God. And since it was kind of a background in the Catholic Church especially, which is very hierarchical and male, which just was unfamiliar to us. And we are women, and we wanted to know our own story. And Clare of Assisi is part of that untold story. The Church's Vatican II, back in the 60s, had a lot to do with this push of scholarship, particularly in our own traditions, because religious communities were asked to go back to their roots. That is, to figure out who they were in light of what their tradition was. And obviously there was a woman in there, and that was Clare of Assisi. So until the early 1993 was the anniversary, the 800th of Clare of Assisi. And that there was a big push of scholarship at that time, and it's just continued, it hasn't stopped. So this is kind of a new study. How come we never knew about Clare? Because first the scholarship is that recent, has just been coming out. So what I'd like to do in the time that I've been allotted today is you should have two handouts. One is a handout of the Clare of Assisi, a mystic for our times, that says Upper Lutheran Church, March 2nd on it. And the other one is a story of Clare of Assisi. Well, how I'd like to divide the morning time is to talk, it's kind of upside down. Instead of talking about Clare in the Middle Ages, you asked me to come and talk about Clare as a mystic. So I'm going to talk about Clare as a mystic. First of all, look at some of the texts and try to understand her life and what that means. And then go back to the story of Clare. Because Clare is from the Middle Ages. I have to curtail myself. I could get talking about the Middle Ages and never get into the topic of the mysticism. So I want to begin there and then we'll go back. So we'll take the handout first. That is just Clare of Assisi, a mystic for our times. I'd like to begin by talking about what the word mysticism means. Someone said, oh, you know what that is. It starts with mist and ends with schism. Well, I'm not so sure that's a good definition. The person who has done the most work in the scholarly world on mysticism is Bernard McGinn, a retired professor from Chicago University. He has written, and just within the last 10 years, a 5-volume series entitled A History of Western Christian Mysticism. And so it's 5 volumes, and the women, Clare of Assisi and the medieval women, are in volume 3. And this is volume 3, which is a sort of the primary source, I would say, for studying the background and the times and how Clare fits into the whole movement of women's movement of history at that time. So he starts off by attempting, what is mysticism? What does it mean? And the description I have on here is under number 1 on this sheet, the last sentence. He talks about it as being the consciousness of God's presence in a deep and immediate way. And then that's a long handle. So he finally shortened it to what the presence of God. That's what but then there's more to it than that, because God is always present and we might not be aware of it. It has to be, as he says in this, a consciousness. We have to know and understand that this is God's presence. And it's not just a small thing, but he uses the word a deep and immediate way, that to have a mystical experience is something we all have. I mean, you look at a baby, a new little baby, and the awe and wonder. We're not so amazed at the snow anymore. I mean, watching a drop of snow, when you watch it come down the lane. I mean, these are times when we're conscious this is of God, comes from God, and we praise and thank God for it. So all these elements are rolled up into it. We very frequently talk about it as the experience of God. So this isn't something that belongs to the professionals. This is all of our lives have these experiences. If you hadn't had experiences of God in your own life, you wouldn't be church-going people. You wouldn't be here this morning. So it's not something for the experts. There's a kind of an everyday, a kitchen mysticism that we all really have. just knowing that God is with us and God is present to us. So the second point on here is about the rise of religious women in the Middle Ages. The stories of spirituality and the church had been very male-dominated until the Middle Ages. And in a sense, that was kind of the rise of women. This is the time when some of the early Benedictine women, Benedict starts in the 6th century, but it took this long for that movement to grow, particularly a woman's movement. And that was sort of the beginning of the writings and the lives of these. A lot of these women lived together and supported one another and shared their experiences of God, and some of them wrote them down. So there are texts that, literary texts that were available but hadn't been translated, and some of the new women scholars wanting to know our story of our relationship with God began to unearth that. So when you put it in the whole story of humankind in the Western world, the Clare of Assisi and Francis fit in the middle period. And that was a period then when women in general were kind of at a high. I mean, if you look at the Catholic Church and the saints who were canonized, more saints were canonized during that time than during any other time in history. So women, holy women, were kind of in. So Clare belongs to that period when women were respected and riding high in the eyes of the church and in the eyes of the world. Now, but what scholars have found, and what Bernard McGinn shows in this book, is that something happened. He calls this the new mysticism. What happened was women were not following the Magdalene before and beating themselves up in their spirituality. It wasn't a penitential spirituality, but they were embracing what they called more of a mystical, personal relationship with God, just for the goodness of God and the goodness of God in themselves. So as you look through their writings, this is an important time for a different approach and a different understanding of who God is and how we relate to God. This is first half of the 13th century. This is the time of Clare and Francis. Now, this third point is the gospel mysticism of Francis and Clare. And I guess I'm just skipping over to the second page on here. What Francis of Assisi did that was unusual in his time and why he stands out is that he understands and promotes the idea that God became human and lives within us on this earth. When you look at the iconography and the pictures, the drawings of the cathedrals, God was this great God up above, over all. And what Francis of Assisi did in his time was to help us understand that God became a human being and lives with us and is like us. And that was a sort of a dramatic shift. It shows up in art, it shows up in writing, it was in their understanding. And so to approach God, we need to look at the story of God, which is the human story of God, which is in the Gospels. So it's called evangelical spirituality because it's based upon the Christ of the Gospels instead of a high, mighty, unapproachable God. God was just like us as a human being, which had not been emphasized up until that time. So that next paragraph talks about Franciscan mysticism in general, how that's unique and set apart from other kinds of mysticism, because the human, the real, Christ was incarnate. He was tangible. It was about stuff. And this is how we get to God, not through taking the spiritual elevator someplace, but right in our midst. That's where Christ was and Christ is in every one of us. And instead of the old penitential spirituality, the importance of the affections. This is the God that we can love with our human emotions. We don't have to strip ourselves of all that is human about us in order to approach and be like God. So that was kind of Francis' drumbeat, over and over again. Now, I'd like to look at some of the texts of Clare of Assisi with these mystical themes. This is one of the things at the end of that first paragraph. Francis talks, as Clare did, about being Clare. This is Clare's text. The last paragraph the last sentence in that first paragraph. She uses common, ecstatic, nuptial imagery portraying the soul as did Francis, mother, sister, spouse. So seeing God living with her soul is not something above us, but relational, and that sort of God being on the level as we are as human beings. So she says in this little inset piece, so it is clear that by God's grace, the soul of a faithful person, the most worthy creature, is greater than heaven, since the heaven and other creatures are not able to grasp the Creator, and only the faithful soul is his dwelling place and throne. And this is possible only through the charity that the wicked lack. So all of us are bearers, Christ bearers, carry Christ into the world within our soul, because Christ is living within our soul. Now this last paragraph talks about the indwelling of God. A lot of these were cloistered women, and the Clare of Assisi was too. So the cloister is important to her, that term. And she understands that Mary, the Blessed Mother, was the cloister. Her womb was the place where Jesus first came upon the earth. So she says at the end of that, using the traditional way of the Song of Songs, adds the love of the poor and the crucified Christ, always emphasizing the mutual love. Clare invites Agnes to embrace the poor Christ, understanding. And she says on the top of the third page, this is a little formula for prayer, because Jesus, as God, was a human being. This is how we can approach God. With our external senses, not getting rid of them, but look. She's this noble queen. She's writing to Agnes of Prague, who was a queen of what we would call the Czech Republic today. Look upon, consider, contemplate, and desire to imitate your spouse, beautiful beyond the sons of all. This is how to pray. We use all of our human senses. Look, eyes, nose, taste, smell. When I pray, usually we have a text, the gospel in front of us. We look at it, we read it. Then the second part is to consider, think about it, meditate upon it. What have you just read? Contemplate. So the looking is a movement of the external senses, the eyes. The considering is employing the mind. The contemplating is love, the heart. The heart is engaged in this. So we meet God from the outside, using all our human senses and our mind, the powers of our mind. And then we employ our capacity as human beings in imitation of God to love one another. So look, consider, contemplate, and then what? The last step is imitate. Do something about it. If Christ was this loving, then as we understand and meet Christ in the Gospels, then what do I do about it? Attempt to do some of the things that Christ did. And they're clearly spelled out for us. Now Clare adds one thing to the whole that was new at this time in spirituality. Francis' spirituality was very liturgical, following the scriptures, the teachings and movement of the church. Clare's has this new sense of mysticism coming in. She uses this concept of the mirror, which Francis never used at all. Place your mind in the mirror of eternity. When I read this, you will see the commandment, love the Lord your God with your whole mind, heart, and soul. This is what she's playing on in here. Place your mind in the mirror of eternity. Place your mind in the splendor of eternity. Place your soul in the splendor of eternity. Place your heart in the figure of the divine substance and transform yourself totally through contemplation into the image of his divinity, so that you too may feel what his friends feel in tasting the hidden sweetness which God has reserved from the beginning for those who love them. So this idea of the mirror, Jesus Christ reflects who God is. He's the visible sign of the invisible God. And the soul also then is a reflection of who Jesus was. So the mirror, look upon God, and she invites Clare to see herself and God in that image. This is the text. Gaze upon that mirror each day. This is Jesus, the incarnate Jesus. O Queen and Spouse of Jesus Christ, and continually study your face. So we are mirrors based upon who Jesus was. Jesus reflects God. We reflect Jesus to ourselves and to other people. Study your face in it, and then some action, so that you may adorn yourself completely within and without, covered and arrayed in needlework, and similarly adorned with the flowers and garments of all the virtues. This is a very, Clare did needlework, as did all the women of the Middle Ages, very much a reflection of women's experience in spirituality. Look upon God, and then what do you do upon it? You sort of plaster all those virtues like flowers on a dress upon yourself. Adorn yourself with those virtues that you saw in studying Christ. As is becoming the daughter and the bride of the King, indeed, in that mirror, and when she looks upon Jesus, she sees poverty, humility, and inexpressible charity shine forth, as with the grace of God, you will be able to contemplate them in the entire mirror. So looking upon Jesus, these three essential virtues stick out for her. The poorness, she calls herself the poor the poor Christ. This sounds like Pope Francis, and he was so conscious of how the poorness of people reflects who God is, becoming poor and coming on earth and living among us. The poverty, the humility, all that Jesus endured in his life, not manifesting or himself as God at all, but being one among human nature, an inexpressible charity. That's obviously the final act of Jesus, who loved us so much that he gave his life for us in the crucifixion. All these things should shine forth within our souls. If we want to be like Christ, look at Christ, have others see the reflection of God within us, it starts through these virtues: poverty, humility, charity. Then the final text on here is Clare's canonization, which is just sort of summarized on here as a new mysticism. It's a new way of approaching God. That was true in the times, as I said, for Francis, with the emphasis upon the human Jesus. And also Clare picks that up. And when they canonized her, it was just more than, she was just a holy woman, but that text says she did something about it, went in the world, and people could see that goodness in one another. So that's just a quick trip over a few of the texts of Clare, in what I would call the mysticism of Clare. Clare's experience of God as a woman, as a medieval woman, and as obviously as a very contemplative soul, mystical soul. Now, I'd like to take a little bit about her times, and that's in this other handout. So, Clare of Assisi, summoned by God. There are a few little errors in this little thing. I picked this up off the internet, I think. Clare of Ferduccio, I mean, it doesn't matter if it's spelled, it's not, they didn't get the Italian. Anybody in here would be offended by the misspelling of Ferduccio. She was born into a aristocratic family. That's not Francis. Francis of Assisi was a merchant class, and there's a lot in here about the struggle that's going on between the two classes at that time. So if any of you have seen what Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, I think it's a story of Francis and Clare, a movie of them, and Zeffirelli, I think, is the one who, it shows Clare and Francis as little children, you know, playing hand in hand in the woods together. And that wasn't so. if any of you, and some of you have been in Assisi, the city of Assisi itself has got two levels to it. The Piazza del Comune down below, where the commoners were, that's where Francis was from. And then up above that is where the cathedral is, where Francis and Clare were probably baptized. And that's where the aristocrats lived. So it was a very strong two-class system. And Francis is down this lower middle class. And this is the time then when the whole feudal system is being, what we call a paradigm shift, being overthrown by the commoners, the poor people who wanted something of the power and control and monies that the aristocrats had. And Francis was one of those upstarts because his father was a merchant, and the Romans initially had coins, but then with the Middle Ages and the routes to the Holy Land and the travel, increased travel, the people were bringing goods from the Holy Land, exotic things that weren't available in Western Europe, and selling them on these trade routes. And that's what Francis' father was doing. He was a merchant. So the merchants had power and wealth. So they had the things that were beginning to gain some of the things that the aristocrats had by birth. So it was there's sort of a civil war going on in the culture of Assisi at that time. Then there's this next, let's see, that's what we needed this. Let's go to the church and society in Clare's world. This is just sort of what I'm talking about now. The rise of the merchant class and how things were changing. And the minorities, the minor class, the commoners, couldn't read or write and didn't have access to anything. And that was about 90% of society. And the aristocrats, Clare's class, was about 10% of society only. And this is what the 90%, the lower class, wanted what the upper class had. That seems like a very imbalanced number until we look at our own society. You know, and when you look at the wealth, the real wealth, it's less than 1% of the wealth in this nation and in this world is owned by fewer and fewer people. It's not available to all. So we don't live in a class system, but we understand. I mean, it's not identified as a class system, it's identified as a democracy, but we understand the flaws of that. And I think that's what, you know, poor old Pope Francis is getting hit in the head for by talking about the evils of capitalism. But I think if we take it out in the noonday sun, we can understand what some of those evils are by imbalancing the opportunity for all people to have access to the goods and things of this world. So the whole culture is being upset at this time. And there, Francis and Clare are right in the midst of it. And so instead of walking through the woods together, they hated each other, the families did. Because Clare's family had the goods as an aristocrat, and this is the thing that Francis was beginning to be able to buy because he was a merchant. So Francis he was a dreamer. He was a party boy and a dreamer. And it's this time of the knights, and he wanted to be a knight. And so in order to be a knight, you had to be upper class, and he wasn't. So Francis' father, because he had money, he bought him a horse, and he bought him a suit of armor. Well, these were things only that were available through the inheritance and the bloodline of being aristocratic. And so the tables sort of were being turned. Well, so Francis had some of the things that his whole class wanted because his father was a wealthy person, because of the merchant class coming in. The merchant class was already beginning to underturn and underdo that system. So where do women fit into this? Women like Clare of Assisi in this upper class. It's kingdom fighting against kingdom for power and authority. And what good are the women? Well, they're bargaining chips, for the kings and those with power. I'll buy your daughter in marriage, and then she brings with her more property. So in a sense, it was property marrying property, and it was all arranged. It was today's society would not tolerate any of that being arranged and sort of used for the good of the supposed good of those with will. So that's a little of the overturning of that system. The second page of this handout talks a little bit about, what about the medieval times at that time. But the whole institutional church at this time was just in a mess. And big news. Pope Innocent was a canonical pope, very bright man, far-seeing. He said something has to be done of this because people all over were starting little churches on their own, and there wasn't a line of authority. And it needed to be done. He said we need to centralize this. There has to be one authority overall. A lot of this shows up in the canonizations. Who got canonized? Well, little local people could canonize one of their local saints. And we talk about, oh, my grandmother was such a saint. We do this in our own language today, but people were officially calling them saints without any, sort of criteria for who that term goes to. So the church did need to reclaim and centralize its own power and set itself up as an authority, so all these small groups of authority weren't springing up all over. What they did with their lives, this next part in here says breaking with conventions. Francis has this universal idea about the world, that Jesus came for all of us. And you hear that in the language, always. It was always all of everything. No one gets excluded. And I think that's what Pope Francis is trying to get at. Every human being has rights, and none of them, just because they are born in a certain way, should be excluded from that. So this council was called the Fourth Lateran Council, and that's a mistake in here. It says it was the third. It's the Third Lateran Council. The text says it was the fourth. The Third Lateran Council was a very significant council in the church that sort of changed the direction and where things were going. We know that in our own time, in how the Second Vatican Council changed the whole direction of the church and the way things were going, even if there's been a little pulling back since that period of time, but perhaps no more again. It was a very it was a time in the church in which there was need for reform. And certainly we look at our own times, and there's always, and no matter the system, always need for reform. So it tells a little bit about how Clare's conversion came about, that she wanted to not be one of these pieces of property that was sold so that her family would have more property. But she wanted to claim her own rights, and she had heard of Francis of Assisi, and she wanted to do what he had done, and that was to give herself and her life totally to and for the love of God. So this thing was rigged up about how she would leave her home, which was not, there were, as we look at the sources, there were 16 knights in the family. I try to think of this little girl with 16 knights clobbering around in all their outfits and so on. But that's really how she grew up. And so when she left her home and decided she was going to go on, do her own thing and follow Francis and not follow the traditions of the family, that's when all the knights came after her. And Francis took her. I mean, if she left her home, she went to where the brothers were. Well, what do you do with a woman? So they took her down to a nearby Benedictine community that was nearby. It was during Holy Week. She left on Palm Sunday. And she stayed there for a week with those sisters during all of Holy Week. And the sources tell us that her heart was not at ease. she knew that wasn't where she fit either, because the Benedictines didn't have the wealth, or had wealth, unlike the way that Francis was leaving. And I'm not bashing the Benedictines, because they've made wonderful contributions to spirituality, but at that time as we study it, the monasteries had great wealth, and the people around them were very, very poor. But they had, it's scandalous, some of the access to food and goods and so on that were within the monasteries. And that isn't what Francis wanted, and that isn't what Clare wanted. So she had to have a different kind of system. If a woman was going to enter a community of women's community at that time, she had to have enough wealth, bring enough money with her to support her for the rest of her life. Well, you can believe a lot of misfits. That's, what do you do with this unmarriageable daughter? Here's some money, go live here. So we found some of these, well, they're beginning people of the third order. When Ramona Miller tells his story, she says they brought their televisions and their hi-fis and smartphones and things with them. But because they had money. And that's the way that they lived for the rest of their life. There was nothing religious about it at all. Needless to say, that got shaken up too and didn't happen forever. What was significant to them in both of their spiritualities was the humanness of Christ, and the humanness of Christ that must come through us as humans. And the care for other people. She used this term about servant leadership, that she was, in the stories about how she took care of her sisters, she waited on them and pre-plumbing. It took a long time for some of these Latin scholars. Regis Armstrong is a friend of mine, and he did some of these initial texts, and they couldn't figure out what this word was, that Clare was always, taking care of these things. Well, it was the bedpans. Because, what do here, imagine 40 women living together. And Clare took care of these. She did the menial tasks, because Jesus is a servant to us all. So if we are going to be like servants, we have to do what Jesus did. That's sort of the essence of the spirituality. This is another text on the last page here, that she got into trouble for what she was trying to do, because in the church it had never been done before. One of my good old Methodist friends said those are the 7 last words of the church. It's never been done this way. And Clare was trying to live without poverty. Well, this isn't what the Benedictines had, because they brought their own poverty. And women couldn't do that. How would they make a living? So work by the work of their own hands. Needlework, and have their own gardens and so on. Well, Agnes of Prague got wind of this movement of women. Francis sent some friars to Prague. Now, this is Northern Europe. And they were trying to live this way. Now, here in Minnesota, let's live off the land. In medieval times, before we had microwaves and frozen goods and so on, how do you do that? It wasn't possible. They had to have a different way of life. And the Pope Gregory was the Pope at that time who was trying to impose that old way of life on them and not let them live according to their hearts and according to their understanding of how Jesus lived as a poor person. So he wrote so Agnes wrote and said, what am I going to do? The Pope is saying you just can't do this. And these are Clare's words in this big text. What you hold, may you always hold. What you do, may you always do, and never abandon. But with swift pace, light step, unswerving feet, so that even your steps stir up no dust, May you go forward securely, joyfully, swiftly on the path of prudent happiness, not believing in anything, not agreeing with anything that would dissuade you from this resolution. Now this is what the Pope says. I mean, this is who she's talking about. It's not believing anyone or agreeing with anyone. Don't do that. Don't give up what you're doing. What you hold, may you always hold. You've got a new vision. She's saying, hang on to it and try to make this work. Dissuade you from this resolution, or that would place a stumbling block for you on the way, so that you may offer your vows to the Most High in the pursuit of that perfection to which the Spirit of the Lord has called you. So she's advising her, you can't go by somebody else's heart and rules. You have to follow, as we say, your own inner voice and your own truth, even if it seems to be contradictory to you. So in this, Clare is a pretty modern, feisty woman. I mean, she has a conviction and she doesn't want to move from it. But why is she a mystic? And this is the question, It's her experience of God, who is poor. It's about as simple as that. And to be like God, you have to be like that. So I want to allow some time here for questions. I always find in these presentations the questions are the best part of this, the most interesting. Questions or comments or what's going through your heads?
Testing. Hello, am I on? Hello. Hello again.
Down on the bottom of the mic?
Yeah, try the bottom.
Oh, it's on. Oh. Hello. Where's Rick? Greetings. Well, put your hands up and
Talk loud. I didn't.
talk loud.
Do you want to take my mic?
Oh, no. I think we want to hear what you
Just repeat the question.
Okay.
Yeah, repeat the question. There we go.
Okay. Hey, anybody have a comment or question or clarification? Or? Yes.
Again, welcome
Thank
to
you.
your sister. And I'm so glad to hear your presentation. We hear that Clare was cloistered. And what has happened in the modern times with Franciscans? Do they still remain cloistered, or do they keep the inner cloister in prayer?
Well, Franciscans are a motley bunch. They can't answer a one-size-fits-all question for Franciscans. One of my friar friends once said, only God knows how many kinds of Franciscans there are. I mean, there are all sorts of ways of being a Franciscan. So there are Franciscans, one branch of them, who are cloistered. And how they interpret that is very, very different. If you want to use the word liberal and conservative, or left or right of left, center, you can. If you know, in Bloomington, Minnesota, there is a house of poor Clares who I would say were left of center. They're very open, have people in. They keep the cloister in their own understanding of what cloister means in the modern world. They live together in the community. They're wonderful, wonderful people. There's another community of cloisters, Franciscan sisters, poor Clares, living in Rockford, Illinois, and they are the opposite. They are right of center because they are, I visited some of these sisters, these cloistered sisters, and you don't ever see them. There's one or two who are appointed to be at the door and answered, and aside from that, they have really no interaction. So it's sort of, in another sense, it depends upon who the abbess is at that time. I mean, each house, separate house, has a spirit, but then the abbess kind of controls it. I know pretty well some of these poor Clares out in Lowell, Massachusetts. And the first time I went there, this wonderful abbess at that time first of all, she was up at the altar in her tennis shoes. This is the new thing. And then she showed me what their parlor was, and where you take your guests, and there was a table in there. And she said, "This is our cloister. You sit on the other side of the table, but you move around the table if you want to too." So, I mean, it's a question of interpretation, but there are definitely, I'm a Franciscan, but I'm a different breed of Franciscan. I'm what's called the third order. The first order is Francis. The second order is the poor Clares, the cloistered sisters. And the third order are the lay women who live and work in the world, and live in community and have lives of prayer together and take vows, but still have secular jobs and get involved in the secular world. And these are the sisters that you know. So we don't do what Clare tried to do, because that isn't what our tradition is. That isn't what our charism is, as we call it. That isn't what we're called to do. What we are called to do is closer to what Francis himself was called to do, and that is to be with people, because that's where they find God. Not bringing God to people, but finding God. I've been a teacher all my life, and how well I know that is true. I mean, the wonderful, human, spiritual people that I have met across the way, because I've taught all levels. I don't teach them, I learn from them. And that's the way we today, as Rochester Franciscans, even in our constitutions, we say this, that we learn, we heal by being healed by the persons that we're with. We learn by learning from the people that we're with. That all of you, God has given us all wonderful, wonderful talents, and we share them with one another, and when we admire them, we want to be like them and do the same thing. And really, that's how we as Franciscans, we see ourselves in the world. And I would say that in one sentence, I don't see myself as bringing God to anybody, but finding God and all the people that I meet. What a wonderful experience for me to be here today. I mean, just to see your dedication and your interest, in the spirituality and your own relationship with God. I mean, you don't find this, when you go to Hy-Vee necessarily. Although the people at Hy-Vee are extraordinarily friendly. They are. They deserve a mark for that. I mean, that grocery store one, stands out above all. I mean, even no matter who they are, they ask you how you're doing. You don't want to say the truth when you don't, because they're not. Okay.
I was always surprised that, isn't it true that the Mother House is in fact a replica of the house in the church that was built in Assisi probably after Francis's time?
The big basilica.
Yeah, it is.
With the red tile roofs. I mean, it's not a piece by piece, but it's Mankato stone, so we didn't go over there use their stone or anything. But it's built in that sort of mold. I mean, with the cloisters in it, and it's supposed to. That's the idea. You caught on. It's not supposed to look like a Minnesota building. I mean, that's an architectural question that I don't want to get into. But St. John's in Collegeville, where Frank Kaczmarek was, I mean, that looks like Minnesota. That's who we are, just plain, solid, cement folks. And this is what our buildings are, none of this soupy, none at all. So, Frank Kaczmarek said that the architecture should grow from, make a statement about who you are. And look at this wonderful, beautiful church. What statement is it making? It says to me that God is important in these people's lives. You know, to donate money to support and finance this church, yes.
Do you find some encouragement that women are having an opportunity for a greater voice in the Catholic Church today?
Yes, some. There is hope. It's not a done deal, but there are a few inroads. It's a long, it's a long, long tradition of men only. So don't expect miracles, not in your lifetime.
Sorry to wait.
Well, thank you to Sister Ingrid for being with us today.
Thank you. It's just been fun to be here with a great audience. I thank you.
You had a good winter? Wow, it was cool on Florida.